Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Brent Venables, the Oklahoma Sooners, working their way through fall camp, and Dill, you're starting to get a feel of what this Oklahoma team is going to look like in 2024. And I want to really dive into what this offensive line is going to look like in the 2024 season. We've been pretty vocal that I think the success that Oklahoma has is very contingent on what this offensive line looks like over the next couple of months. And you got to give Brent Venables and this Oklahoma staff a ton of credit. We've said it the last couple of weeks. You go back to early January, there were some massive question marks about what this Oklahoma offensive line was going to be heading into the SEC. Now we enter into fall camp and you say, look, we're still trying to figure out what our best starting five is for this Oklahoma offensive line. But at this point, you feel kind of good that it's going to be a quality unit. You have a nice combination of some young talent on the offensive line. You also brought in a lot of veteran experience as well. That's kind of how you want it to look like. And you're starting to get some feedback on how the offensive line is shaking out. Want to dive into that, talk about a few other Oklahoma standouts during fall camp. Before we get into it, as always, would love to hear from the Oklahoma fans on how they think this offensive line shakes out. If you want to just give your projected starting five, we'll chop it up in the comments section. There are a lot of different ways this Oklahoma offensive line might look week one of the college football season. We're going to do our best to project it as well. And if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. The Oklahoma fans, whether we're doing film reviews, talking recruiting, you guys continue to show a ton of love. We appreciate you guys. And Dill, without further ado, let's start at the offensive tackle spot, where that was probably our biggest question mark heading into fall camp, where I look at the inside. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Feel really good that the inside of the Oklahoma offensive line is going to be awfully competitive. Now, when you start talking about the tackle spot, that's where you're kind of still trying to figure it out. Now, I think the biggest piece of news for Oklahoma fans is that Jacob Sexton and Jake Taylor have really seemed to take that step going into year three. And I think it sounds like there's a really good possibility that Jacob Sexton's your starting left tackle and Jake Taylor is your starting right tackle. And we kind of both said heading into fall camp, that was probably the best possible outcome for this Oklahoma tackle spot.
Because when you talk about getting your best five on, and in the spring, I think we talked about it, it was almost like a little disappointing to see Jacob Sexton playing that left guard spot, mainly because you kind of keep a really good player on the bench because they have too many good players in the inside and not enough good players on the outside. And I think you saw enough from Jacob Sexton. He didn't play great offensive tackle last year. Go back to that bowl game. He looks like he has the athletic traits to do it, but there definitely need to be some polish. And I think that's when, as an Oklahoma fan, I think you're thinking, like, I think we can get him up to speed. I think we can get him up to a high-level tackle play. And I think it's good to hear that in this spring or in this fall camp window, it seems like that's the route they're going to go, because I think that is what they have to do to get their best five.
Yeah, they brought in guys like Michael Tarquin and Spencer Brown to kind of just, I almost view it as like an insurance policy. It's like, all right, if Jacob Sexton or Jake Taylor don't necessarily put it together going into year three, at least we have a guy like Spencer Brown, who you look up and started the last two seasons in the Big Ten at Michigan State, or a guy like Michael Tarquin, who's played the tackle position in the SEC for the Florida Gators at, relatively a high level at times in that 2022 season. You knew those were going to be solid tackles, probably at best. But you always kind of knew that the best version of this Oklahoma offensive line was if Jake Taylor and Jacob Sexton kind of took those steps. And Dill, I want to talk a little bit about Jake Taylor, because we've seen a decent amount of Jacob Sexton, and I think him kind of commanding that left tackle spot, at least what you're hearing from fall camp, that's a massive storyline. Jake Taylor kind of settling in at that right tackle spot, I think that's massive, because we haven't seen a ton of Jake Taylor. He's kind of played that utility offensive line role for Oklahoma. Love this kid coming out of Bishop Gorman. I think he might be the most talented offensive lineman out of this unit. And now that he's putting it together at right tackle, and you might have some really quality tackle play from those two players, I think the conversation on the inside of the offensive line gets a little bit more exciting as well.
I think for Jake Taylor, you kind of said it. I think there is one trait I think he's got in abundance, and that's strength. I don't think there's many other offensive linemen in the country who are stronger in the upper body. And when you kind of look, like, there's certainly still some polish that needs to be put on him too, in terms of how he moves his feet when he's in pass pro. There were a couple times where he just didn't really get out of his stance quick enough and get enough depth, and he was getting beat on the edge a little bit. But again, a guy who I think has the similar to Jacob Sexton, has the physical traits to be a good offensive tackle, especially because he is strong enough where if he can get his hands on guys, he does do a really good job. So, again, two guys that will be really interesting to see come day one what they look like, because really talented, have seen kind of up and down moments and what in the limited what we've seen from either of them. But two guys who I think you're right. At the end of the day, Spencer Brown, Michael Tarquin are nice depth pieces for good teams, but they're not like good starting tackles on really high level football.
Yeah, and I think one more thing for Jake Taylor is there's probably some reason you saw some struggles maybe in the spring game, or at times the kid just played all over the offensive line. So kind of from a technical standpoint, he didn't really have a home during his first 2 years. Really talented kid. Obviously, wasn't going to start over the tackle play that Oklahoma had last year because he just didn't really have a place to kind of call home on the offensive line. I don't know if it stunted his development, but I think as he continues to settle into that right tackle spot, I think he's just going to get better and better at that right tackle position. Now, you look on the inside of the offensive line, I thought one of the massive storylines for Oklahoma in the transfer portal was bringing in Branson Hickman. This is a guy that, 36 total starts coming from SMU, first team all-conference guys, played over, 2,400 snaps during his career. We ain't got no question marks about Branson Hickman at that center spot. Then you look at the guard spot, it sounds like Fabici Nuewu is kind of running away with one of the guard spots. And then I think at the other spot, you have a guy like Keith Ozeda, who I'm kind of a believer in. And then you have Gary and Hatchett, who started a decent amount of games for Washington last year on a Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. It's, again, that combination of, hey, we got some talent. I would throw in a guy like Eugene Brooks as well, as a guy that can emerge as a starter at some point during the season. But we also have a guy in Gary and Hatchett who, hey, we know he's going to be a quality guard at the SEC level in 2024 as well.
And one guy I think is worth noting is Troy Everett. When he's ready to go, he is certainly a guy who can slot into this interior, whether it's at center or whether it's more likely at guard, obviously, with Hickman coming in. But a guy who, when he's healthy, he's a really, really good football player in his own right.
I think Troy Everett, and kind of how I see him getting used, and you asked me a couple months ago before the injury, I probably would have started him, kind of plugged him as a starter on the inside of the offensive line because of the injury and because of some of the additions they made in the transfer portal, most notably Branson Hickman. Maybe Troy Everett kind of becomes that utility guy on the inside where it's like, hey, if we have to make a change or somebody goes down, you have a guy in Troy Everett who, again, I think is a really good football player on the inside of the Oklahoma offensive line to kind of culminate this conversation. If you're an Oklahoma fan, one, I think Jake Taylor and Jacob Sexton emerging, massive news. I think that's the best version of this Oklahoma offensive line, is if those two players kind of reach their potential. I think they're both NFL caliber tackles. And then on the inside, it's just a lot of competitive depth. It's a lot of experience, and it's just kind of hard to see this Oklahoma offensive line being a liability like we might have thought it was going to be early January until Brent Venables got active in the transfer portal. Now,
I think that's the fair thing to say. I don't think it'll be the engine of this team by any stretch of the imagination. I do think, like, you look, those wide receivers, even some of the talent they have in the running back room, like, I think that's going to be what makes them go. But I do think this offensive line certainly, again, if those two young guys can emerge on the tackle spots, this offensive line is in a really good position to be a competitive unit.
Now, I think the other two notable storylines for Oklahoma on offense, Taylor Tatum, Javante Barnes at the running back spot. We kind of went into fall camp saying, hey, and we even did a freshman spotlight on Taylor Tatum saying there's some opportunity to get into the running back rotation, right? You look at Gavin Sawchuk, I think he's one of the better running backs in the SEC. He's going to be your running back one. Now, the question is, all right, who's going to be running back two, running back three? You saw a lot of buzz around Caleb Hicks coming out of spring, which fires me up. He did look very good in spring. But now you're starting to hear Javante Barnes is starting to look like himself again, which, again, you talked to me 24 months ago. I would have said Javante Barnes would be the running back one on this Oklahoma team in 2024. We know Javante Barnes can play, and I give him a lot of credit for sticking with this Oklahoma program. And then Taylor Tatum, a guy that we just kind of had a sense coming out of high school was going to play early. He put on some nice weight. He's up to 205 pounds. So from a physicality standpoint, you feel good. He's also a pass catcher, brings a little bit different of a dynamic in terms of how he runs the football as well. If you're Oklahoma at the running back spot, I think you're kind of feeling pretty good about that hierarchy in terms of Gavin Sawchuk, Javante Barnes, Taylor Tatum, and potentially even Caleb Hicks. Now, another storyline is the wide receiver position. And Dill, we talk about it a lot. Andrel Anthony working his way back, not necessarily a full goal yet, but what I think is encouraging for Oklahoma fans is if you don't get Andrel Anthony back for Temple, Houston, Tulane, you probably still start 3-0. That being said, if you can kind of work his way back, maybe 10, 15 snaps at the wide receiver position during those games, or maybe just not play him at all, but have him kind of ready for week 4 when you host Tennessee, that's probably what you're looking at in terms of the peak wide receiver room for this Oklahoma program.
Yeah, Andrel Anthony will be a big one for them. I think you saw him play so effectively for them last year in terms of just being a really good, clean route runner. And I think you look like Jaleel Farouk, that's not necessarily his game, I don't think. He's much more, when he's at his best, he's getting the ball behind the line of scrimmage, making plays in space and doing things with, like, as a runner. I think that's where he stands out. Andrel Anthony, to me, probably, aside from Deion Burks, who now comes in and certainly becomes their wide receiver, I think he's one of the best in the country. And I don't think that's unfair to say. Andrel Anthony is that other wide receiver who does do a really good job of creating separation just as a pure route runner. And I don't know that you have anyone else on that team who is right now.
Especially on the boundary. You know what I mean? I think Andrel Anthony is so important to this Oklahoma wide receiver room in terms of the specific skill set he has. Where Deion Burks, we know he's going to be a dog in that slot. I think he's going to be the leading receiver for this team. I think the offense is largely going to run through Deion Burks. You look at Nick Anderson. He's a guy that averages 18 yards per reception. He's going to work vertically down the field, make safeties have to respect what he can do. Now, what is that other wide receiver you're looking for is that wide receiver that can separate and kind of work that intermediate route tree and create separation and be active after the catch. That's what Andrel Anthony does. I think he's that missing piece to that Oklahoma wide receiver trio. And if you were to kind of talk about, like we had the conversation of what's the best version of Oklahoma's wide receiver room, it's with Andrel Anthony playing that role and then using guys like Jaleel Farouk or Jaquez Petaway or Brennan Thompson as your speedster as kind of supplement to those 3 wide receivers.
Yeah, I think that'd be a fair way to put it. And again, Jaleel Farouk is the one interesting one to me because I look back to his sophomore year. I thought he was coming on. I was like, oh, this is going to be a big year. Last year, they felt like maybe a bit of a step back in a sense. Yeah. I don't know if that's fair, but didn't think he had a great year. He's one. I know we're talking about Andrel Anthony, and I think Andrel Anthony's really, really good and probably is that second guy, if you will. But I'm not totally convinced Jaleel Farouk, if he doesn't kind of rebound himself, can get right back in the mix as being like one of their focal points, someone that they kind of can run their offense very much through.
It's a very contested topic, Jaleel Farouk. I mean, you look at the message board, some people say you should have just hit the transfer portal. I kind of fall into your boat. Like, I look at Jaleel Farouk and say, hey, we've seen some really good football out of this kid. 12 months ago, we were talking about him being the wide receiver 1 in this Oklahoma offense, and that wasn't unfair to say 12 months ago. Can you get back that form? And again, I don't think Jaleel Farouk's going to be a starter in this Oklahoma wide receiver room with Andrel Anthony, Nick Anderson, and Deion Burks, but there is a specific skill set that Jaleel Farouk brings to the table that you want to have in your Oklahoma offense. And so if I'm Oklahoma, I'm reading the fall practice notes, and obviously the number one thing is, what does this offensive line look like? Because if you get a solid offensive line in the SEC, Jackson Arnold, with all the talent he has at wide receiver, especially the tight end position kind of actually being a position that we're going to use in this Oklahoma offense once again, I think this team can be really dangerous. And again, we trust the development that we're seeing on the defensive side of the football, but to hear that Taylor, Jacob Sexton stepping up on the offensive line, I think that's the biggest storyline that you're getting in the early parts of fall camp. We'll continue to monitor the storyline. Again, nothing is set in stone on this Oklahoma offensive line. It is a lot of competition that you're seeing take place. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.